It was my wife who suggested roleplay, despite what she may say elsewhere. You'll just have to decide who you think is being honest. When she first suggested acting out roles, I was hoping for pigtails and pleated skirts, but I should have figured it wouldn't be like that. If I'm honest, there isn't much that I wouldn't have agreed to at that point in our relationship. Things weren't bad, but, well, they weren't good either. One morning I woke up to a packed lunch and an orange juice on the breakfast table, and when I tried to make myself a cup of coffee, she told me that growing boys shouldn't drink things like that. I typically skipped breakfast and headed right out the door each morning, but the way she sat there looking at me made me feel like I was missing something. It took me a minute to realize that this right here was the start of our little pretend play, so I sat down and ate the cereal and drank the juice. The whole scene made me pretty uncomfortable. I guess I just felt on the spot. Sounds weird, but I've always had a bit of a thing about people cooking for me. My mum died when I was 8, and my dad didn't really pay me much attention. I had to cook and clean and iron my uniform every night before school, and no one ever did my homework for me. Later on, my dad married some poor waitress half his age, and treated her like a servant. And I realized that must have been exactly how he had treated my mother. I'm not saying that this taught me to be the perfect man or anything, far from it. I just didn't like things that made me feel like I was becoming my dad. But there was my wife, making me cereal for breakfast, and then handing me a neat little lunchbox with cartoons on it that I'd watched as a kid. Goku, that was a throwback. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't like some part of it. Driving to work that day, I decided that this roleplay was probably just some kind of therapy, and that it was best to go along with it. Even after I got home that night to find that she'd run me a bath. Not only did she want me to be a clean little boy, she'd even laid out some brand new pajamas. It was deeply uncomfortable. She perched on the toilet lid, while I was sat upright in the tepid water, not sure what to do with myself. The grown man with a beer belly hunched over in grey water. I felt so stupid. "Do you need help washing yourself?" she cooed. Sure," I replied, and she came over and pulled out a fish-shaped bottle of No Tears shampoo. She washed my hair, using a small plastic cup to rinse my scalp. I had to lean back for her to get it all, and she held my head in her hands. I hated it. My eyes wouldn't stay shut, her hands were too cold, the water too warm, the porcelain of the tub too hard. And every time the water flowed over my head, I would reflexively lurch forward and try to sit up, which of course meant I got suds in my eyes. "Shush," she kept saying. "Just lie back. It won't hurt. I won't let it." So I laid back and controlled my breathing and told myself that it was for her sake, not mine. One of my last memories of my mother was her reading a book while I sat in the bath, and I guess I didn't like how I felt in my wife's arms at that moment. But she just kept talking to me in that soothing voice, and somewhere along the lines I let go of conscious thought, and focused on the sensation of the warm water rolling down my scalp. "You can let go," she said, wiping some water from my face, and when I looked up at her, I realized that I was shaking, and my heart was pounding. All of a sudden it all just came out, all the tension, all the anxiety, the constant state of near panic that I'd suppressed for my entire life. You're meant to say that this kind of stuff feels cathartic, but I fucking hated it. It made me feel physically sick. Even a little ashamed. She held me in her arms, while I sobbed like a baby in the tub, and when it was finally over, all I could think was, "Thank God I can breathe again." I let her dry me as I stood dripping wet on the tiles. And then I let her dress me in the cool dry pajamas she'd laid out ready, the silky fabric raising goosebumps on my skin. By the time I curled up into bed, her arms cradling my head like it was a precious jewel. I was exhausted, like I'd just gone for a quick 30-mile run. The last thing I remember was the theme tune to Ed, Edd n Eddy, and the flood of nostalgia combined with the feel of fresh bed linen put me to sleep hard and fast. The next day at work I felt dirty, and I didn't much enjoy the thought of going home. I knew what was waiting for me, and sure enough she was there with SpongeBob pajamas, brand new, in one hand, and a plate of food in another. At first I told her I wasn't up for it that night, but she just told me to stop being silly and sit down to eat. And well, the food did look good. And, stupid as this is, I told myself it was me doing her a favor, you know. Like if I just agreed to have her do all this stuff for me, it would be okay, so long as I agreed begrudgingly. So I ate the food, and wore the clothes, and I tried not to cringe when she called me her baby boy. As much as I hated it, she was being really nice to me. I just wanted her to like me. She hadn't liked me in so long, and this whole messed up business meant that she was being genuinely affectionate to me. For years she'd always kinda looked at me like I was a dick. I don't know where, but somewhere along the line I stopped being her husband, and just became a husband, just another emotionally stunted guy with a receding hairline. I could have been more attentive, I know that. But nobody told me how exhausting mediocrity is, and by the time I got through barely surviving work each day, I'd find very little energy left to give to her. I felt lonely all the time, and something about being in her arms made me feel a little less alone. I secretly hoped that this roleplay was about dismantling the walls we'd both put up. It wasn't on my terms, I would have picked literally anything else. But hey, when is life ever fully on anyone's terms? Being in love really means being held hostage. And yeah, things were bad, but man, I fucking loved her with everything I had. So I had to work with what I had, and what I had was this weird roleplay. Figured that it makes some sense, that some women didn't want a daddy. That instead some women actually wanted to be a mommy. You see it online all the time, right? Daddy this, daddy that. You can't throw a stone online without finding some pornographic image of a woman being infantilized. So why couldn't it go the other way around? So long as it wasn't sexual, I figured I could do it. I'd wear the pajamas, watch cartoons, and ask for help coloring in the lines. In the end, I didn't just go along with it for a few nights. I went along with it every single day that followed, and I found that every day there was a little more of it to go along with. The packed lunches became more elaborate, the food I ate grew simplified, until it was practically the kind of stuff you'd feed a toddler. And one Friday when I finally told her I wanted a break, she just told me to stop being silly. She used that phrase a lot during the roleplay, and this is going to sound fucking stupid, but she made me feel silly when she said it. Her voice immediately made me feel small and ashamed, just like I had in the bath, and before I even realized I was doing it. I was sliding the pajamas on and booting up my Xbox while she messed around in the kitchen. I'd actually planned on talking to her that night about going to couples therapy, but she spoke to me like a little boy, and I just couldn't stop myself reacting like one. It was like I'd been trained. That weekend I listened to her tell me stories as I sat on the counter kicking my legs, and I think I felt something die inside me. On some level I have to take some responsibility. I ate the food I wanted to eat, and when she asked if there was anything I wanted, I always had something to say. I watched the TV I wanted to and wore the clothes she put out for me, and pretty soon I got used to not thinking about those things. Pretty soon every single day was spent with her. Some nights were movie nights and we'd watch her favorite films, while she told me all about the memories she had of first watching them. Some nights were mommy nights where she'd sit and drink wine and watch her own shows while I played games. We made forts out of cushions, camped in the backyard, played cowboy and Indian using Nerf guns, and chased each other round the house for hours at a time, doing hide and seek, or some homebrew version of tag. If I had to describe this time, it was like being in a waiting room, only I didn't have a number or a clock or any way of knowing how much time has passed. The only way I could even tell that time was passing was that I lost weight. In fact, I lost a lot of weight. My wedding ring slipped right off my finger one day, and where it went after that, I'll never know. I still don't understand this part of it, but I remember that I just kept getting thinner. For about 3 weeks I fell ill with some stomach bug. And I spent my days in bed watching telly while she checked my temperature and fed me chicken soup. And by the time I came out of it, I was wearing a child's large set of pajamas. I mean, how does that even work, right? I started the year weighing 120 kilograms. In the end I got down to 45. Not only that, but my hair started getting thin and downy, and I couldn't even remember when I'd last needed a shave. I asked her about this one day, and she played it dumb, like she didn't know what was happening to me. But out of the two of us, she must have known because it was literally right in front of her eyes. I was changing. She recommended that I stay home until I felt 100% myself again, which of course meant that I never went back to work because I never ever felt like myself a guy. Looking back, it wouldn't surprise me if she forged a resignation letter of mine, or did something similar to keep me at home. Either way, by the time the stomach bug passed, I was trapped in that house. The outer gate, that had once barely reached my chest, now towered over my head and I could barely get my fingers around the bars. It wasn't a new gate, or at least I didn't think it was. It was just somehow taller than me all of a sudden. Things stopped making sense around this time, and looking back it's hard to disentangle certain memories and ideas. I don't even remember the crib arriving. It was just there one day, along with a whole new room in the house that physically shouldn't have been there. I checked one late night when I felt lucid, and sure enough the bathroom and master bedroom hadn't magically shrunk by 50%. But somehow a whole new room had just sprung up between them. And it was painted in baby blue, and the walls were covered in paintings of airplanes, and if I stared at them too long I'd feel real sleepy, and my head would get heavy and boom. Next thing I remember, it'd be morning and I'd be staring at a bowl of cereal. Whole chunks of time were purged from my head. And not just the recent stuff either. I was an accountant who suddenly couldn't do long division, and struggled with his multiplication tables. Normally my brain was like a cacophony of fireworks that took every ounce of my willpower to keep under control. Stray thoughts just pinged off all the time, and it was chaotic, but it was me. But with my wife. And with everything going on, it had turned into something more like a cobweb with holes poked in it. You know when you listen to someone, and their voice just turns into a drone, and you realize that you stopped listening after a few words. It was like that, but with my own thoughts. As soon as I got any momentum going I lost interest and time faded, and I'd come to a few hours later bouncing up and down on my wife's knee. I could practically feel bits of my mind sloughing away like candle wax, leaving big patches of nothing behind, and it hurt so bad. It hurt worse than anything physical that ever happened during that fucked up time. Something was cutting my mind up like a scrapbooker going at old magazines, and I could feel it happening in real time. There were times when she'd take something off me like the remote and put it on the counter, and it'd just hang there over my head, and that just doesn't make sense to me. And the harder I concentrate to try and figure that out, the more it feels like staring right at the sun. And it wasn't just me. There were a couple of moments when she'd look at me, and I wouldn't see my wife. Actually, that's not right. She was my wife. Absolutely 100% my wife. She just had an extra 2 pairs of limbs and... It hurts even now to try and remember too clearly. What I do know was that as time went on I felt less like precious cargo, and more like a leaden weight she had to lug from place to place. Some nights I'd wake up, and spot her stood in my doorway looking at me, and the expression on her face. Holy shit, it was murderous. I'd have to lie there and pretend for hours that I was snoring gently because on some level I just knew it'd be bad news. The time we spent together started to change, and more often than not I'd try to stay out in the garden and play with toys. Only I wasn't really playing. I was just pretending, hoping that if my performance was good then she wouldn't get any more irritated with me. Without knowing when, why, or how, rules were introduced. I'd go to do something like make myself a drink and stop, hand frozen halfway to an empty glass, and remember that I wasn't allowed to get glasses out of the cupboard by myself. I didn't know how I knew that. I just knew it. I wasn't allowed to play games past 7. I wasn't allowed to get my own snacks. I wasn't allowed in the garden without telling her where I was going. And if I broke these rules. One time I threw a ball and broke a window, and she exploded out of that screen door like a fucking bull. It felt so wrong to feel scared of her. She was meant to be looking after me. Those were the roles we were meant to be playing. But she grabbed my arm, and pulled it so hard it popped right out the socket, and I begged for the game to stop, but nothing I said could snap us out of these fucked up roles we'd made. She dragged me into the house, and I passed out around about the time my head bounced off the third step on our porch. When I woke up I was sat in a high chair and strapped in real good. Something hurt but I ignored it. All I wanted was for this pissed off woman to love me again. I was so terrified I would have done anything she asked. She was the only thing I had to keep me safe in the world, and my head was full of all the amazing stuff she did for me. The food, the gifts, the movies, the clothes, the bathing. I could see how tired she was. It was me making her that tired. So I cried and I sobbed, and I said sorry so often my throat got sticky and dry, and I started to heave. When her terrible frown finally broke, she ran towards me with her arms wide open, and pulled me out of that chair. She told me to never make her hurt me again, saying it over and over again as she sat me down on the sofa and rolled up my pajamas to show me my chubby legs. Something was jutting out of the skin, and before I could figure out what it was, she pinched it with her finger and thumb, and drew it out in one long motion. It was a needle, a little sewing needle that had been slid painfully into the thick fatty muscle of my thigh. There have to be rules, she said. And there have to be consequences. But don't worry, I want you to know it hurts me just as much as it hurts you. We both suffer when you break the rules. I want you to know that you don't just hurt yourself, you hurt me. I watched as she placed the bloody needle on her tongue and swallowed it. When the doorbell rang I was looking at the diapers around my waist. I didn't know when or how they had gotten there, and weirdly I remembered thinking the exact same thing that morning. And the morning before that. The longer I thought about it, the harder it was for me to remember when I'd last actually used a toilet. The realization horrified me. Some of the memories flashing into my head, it was like I was experiencing them for the first time all over. The timid woman I'd married was somehow suddenly so strong, able to not only overpower me, but able to actually lift me off the ground, to pick me up and lay me down on a small table and hoist my legs up and... Jesus Christ, she changed me, I thought, and my whole body flushed with unspeakable humiliation. I think it was that feeling that let me keep my head together when the deliveryman came, like I had this little bit of defiance that stopped me trying to hide from the stranger. This is my chance, I thought. Wait, no, I'm not allowed to open the door, not for strangers. But I can speak to him. Maybe he can help. Someone has to help. But if she comes and finds me, then I'm in trouble. I don't want to be in trouble. It was like being drunk, or like having my thoughts handcuffed to a maniac. I had to fight every step of the way to stay a man, and not a child, and I pulled at the handle eager to get some perspective on what was happening to me. Only I never got to even see the guy because that was when the bathroom door slammed shut. She's coming. And I knew that, if she found me then I'd get one hell of a punishment. My legs and arms already hurt so bad. I wasn't a very good boy. I knew. I broke a lot of rules, and it didn't help that new ones were popping up all the time. I fled towards the kitchen, turning the corner just in time for the door to swing open, and for this delivery guy to get a good look at me. I briefly turned to face him, and the way he reacted to the sight of me, I expected to feel embarrassed, but I just felt scared. Something was happening to me, and the fact that this guy could see it made it horrifyingly real. My body had changed, and no matter what my wife wanted, I wasn't a child. I was changing into something, but it wasn't a normal kid. This wasn't Benjamin Button. Whatever happens when you cram a chubby middle-aged guy into a 3-foot package, the result isn't a cute little kid. It's a nightmare. I ran crying from the look in his eye and got as far as the garden, when I heard my wife thunder into his living room. "Who let you in?" she cried. "I have children in this house. Who are you and why are you in my home?" Poor guy was dumbstruck. I could hear him stammering away as I ran under the porch steps and waited. I'd learned this was one of the few places where she couldn't physically fit. The few times I'd hidden under there, she'd had to calm herself down, and that made things a little easier on me. At least in the short term. Now I hoped it'd keep me safe long enough that I could maybe even make a break for it when the guy left the gate. She childproofed it with some infuriating mechanism that my fat fingers couldn't work. But it sure did take a long time for that gate to swing open and close, and that right there was the best chance I was ever gonna get. "Get out of my house," she screamed at him as he flew down the steps. She followed, hot on his heels. "Who's your manager? Who do you work for? I want to put in a complaint. I want you to know exactly how goddamned badly you've messed up." This guy was stuttering and mumbling and fumbling, unsure of whether to run away or turn and give this woman a decent account of himself. I hoped he would leave. I was hidden so well, and if he opened that gate, then I would finally have a chance to get the hell away from this living nightmare. This guy was still trying to answer when my wife stepped down onto the path and turned to me slyly, raising one eyebrow right in my direction, where I thought I was hidden. Jesus Christ, the terror I felt. I pissed myself. I thought I'd got one over on her, but she knew the whole time and she had something planned. "Look at this," she said. "Look at this step. This wasn't damaged until you came along." The guy looked confused as hell, and I couldn't blame him. He'd been bombarded with conflicting complaints. It was like he was grasping at air to understand everything he'd seen. It wasn't just my wife going off at him. It was the memory of what he'd seen. It was the memory of me. Bent down to take a look, and my wife encouraged him to get closer. I wondered why she was making him get so close to my hiding spot. Did she want to humiliate me? Did she want to parade the little freak around? I thought she must have known how much my body upset me, and she was going to use that fact to torture me a little bit. But it was nothing that tame. Without warning, his face slammed into the middle step, his head bouncing off like a coconut. Only she was there ready to catch it, and before either one of us could figure it out, she had shoved his head right back against the wooden step. He started to swear, then shout, then cry, and then finally he screamed. And screamed. And screamed. It lasted so long. She never stopped pushing, and somehow, impossibly, he started to give way. The sides of his skull started to crumple, his eyes bulged, his teeth popped out and fell to the floor like coins from a slot machine. I had to pull my legs up just to keep them from landing on my bare feet. I had front row seats to the worst fucking horror show I could ever think of, watching that guy get scalped in slow motion. Only it didn't stop at his head. She kept pushing until his shoulders started to pop and crack. Arms bent backwards, bones snapped, muscle and skin were peeled off with a sound like Velcro. In the end, he poured out of that little 6-inch gap, and fell onto the floor in a quivering pile of skin and flesh. The only thing left on the other side was my wife's face staring at me through the gore-coated wood. "Come on," she grinned. "Put your new toy away. I'll make you some lunch." I was sitting outside pretending to watch the clouds go by, aware that she was behind the kitchen window and pretending to wash dishes. He was looking right at me, even if I couldn't see her. I'd watched her clean that guy up, watched her dump him in an old compost pile round back. He wasn't the only one down there. I saw all my old clothes, my laptop, my phone, my keys, my mail, everything that used to be me, and I'm not just talking about things. I'd never really thought of it much, but I'd shrunk and changed, and I guess all that meat and bone and fat had to go somewhere. I just hadn't realized that she tied it up in dripping bed sheets and plopped it at the farthest point in our yard. I don't know how to explain it. Couldn't even begin to tell you how it feels to grieve your own body like that. Whatever defiance I had was gone, especially after seeing what she did to that delivery guy. Coming to terms with who, or rather what I was, meant that I lost all desire to escape. I would have tried to overdose if it wasn't against the rules for me to go anywhere near the medicine cabinet. I ran a thumb across the purple and yellow flesh of my thigh, the skin riddled with 1,000 infected puncture marks. Can't break the rules, I thought. When a frisbee floated freely over the hedge, I stared at it for a moment like I was a disinterested cat. My eyes tracked it, but nobody was home upstairs, if you get what I mean. Only when it landed gently on the grass, and I heard the gate clang open, did it dawn on me that I wasn't alone out there. It was a little girl, and her reaction wasn't all that different to the delivery man's. She stopped dead in her tracks, and started to cry a loud distress wail. I wanted to ask her for help, but I didn't want to face the way she looked at me, so I quietly scuttled off towards the bushes to hide. Or at least I started to. That was when I heard the screen door bang, and my wife came down the steps with a big smile on her face. "It's okay," she cooed, reaching out to hold the girl. Only our visitor couldn't see the kitchen knife my wife clutched behind her. "I won't let anyone ever hurt you." When she started walking towards our kitchen door, something broke. I felt a special kind of hatred burn inside me. It wasn't a defiance so much as pure spite. The kind of feeling that'd make you scream "I hate you" over and over at your parents, just to see them hurt. It sounds stupid, but as much as part of me wanted to keep that little girl safe, another part of me was just plain old jealous. After everything my wife had done to me, I couldn't bear the thought of her bringing another child into the house. I started to run towards the two of them, and my wife, spotting me, hoisted the girl up into her arms. Only that slowed her down so much that I reached them both before she'd even got up the first step. I tried to grab the girl's coat when I jumped, but wound up grabbing a fistful of hair. Everything that happened next was a jumble, but my wife slashed my arm and wrist with that big knife of hers, and I pulled so hard on the poor girl's head that a load of her hair came free in my arm. In the end, though, I think it helped, because this girl started screaming like hell, and when she got a good look at me, that was when the fear really kicked in, and she started wriggling and kicking and punching. And my wife, who really wasn't ready for just how hard it can be to keep a hold of a pissed-off kid, ended up dropping the little girl. Once her feet were on the ground, that kid just zipped right out of there, and I did everything I could to keep my wife away from her. It wasn't a whole lot, but I think it helped. I think between the way my messed up appearance got the girl running, and the way I managed to hold onto my wife's legs for long enough to trip her up a little, I think I saved that kid. Looking back on everything that my wife cost me, I guess that was one of the few little victories I ever had. As soon as the gate clanged shut, all that feeling of triumph dribbled away. I crawled back towards the porch steps as quick as I could, and the best way to describe it is that, even though I wasn't looking at her, when my wife's eyes found me, I could feel them. Her rage, it must be what it's like to stand next to radioactive waste. I swear my shadow got darker, and the ground got a little hotter. And the noises I heard, they didn't sound like they came from an upset woman. Not sure what they sounded like really, except maybe a strange kinda clicking. When I finally got under the house and turned, I saw that she looked big enough to crush a man like a bug. I don't know how to describe it, except it was a little like looking at something with 3D glasses, or the way your eyes feel funny just before a big migraine, I guess. For just a second I saw her as something that wasn't human, but the part that really hurts my head is that she never changed. It was the same entity I'd married on the altar, only now I got the same feeling I did looking at dead spiders or leathery roadkill. She'd never really been human, had she? And with my memory shot to shit, I wasn't even willing to bet that I'd even married this thing. You read about those parasites that lay eggs in their hosts. Looking at her as she scuttled towards me, yeah, I got the sense that's what she was. Some kinda parasite. She stopped just a few inches from the steps, her face peering at me through the gaps. She blinked with a third set of eyelids, and smiled so white her skin started to lose its color and break. "I will drown you in my womb," she said, as calmly as she would ask if I wanted cut up hot dogs in my spaghetti. I believed her. I didn't come out of those stairs for the rest of that day, not even when my wife stood out on the porch and called me for dinner. I didn't fancy my chances with whatever was shambling around up there and pretending to be a wife or a mother. Or whatever else it felt like. I didn't want anything she'd prepared. And as time wore on, I found that the hunger in my stomach sharpened my mind so that I didn't mind it too much. Besides, I could hazard a guess that she wasn't being honest about what was in my food, and I didn't want anything she prepared. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't really a game now. The stakes were too high. And for me, tucked away under those steps with my stomach growling and my mind growing more lucid with every passing second, I really started to hate her. I hated that she'd hurt me when she was supposed to protect me. I hated that she'd lied every second of every day until this sick little plan of hers had come to fruition. But more than anything, I hated her for what she'd done to me. I wasn't a man, but I sure as hell wasn't a child. I was more like a monster and a joke, and I just knew that somehow she'd been the one stripping meat and fat off my bones until my frame withered to this pitiable size. I had to leave. I had to. She'd since locked the gate, and I needed the key, and if she stopped me, well, I guess I needed a knife, didn't I? I needed something to keep me safe. I waited until sunset and crawled out from under the house, making sure to stick to the shadows. Peeking through the kitchen window, I saw her stood there with a plate in one hand and a blank expression on her face. She looked a little broken, like she didn't quite know what to do now that I wouldn't listen to her cries of dinner time. She just stood there and shivered until some flicker of movement caught her eye, and she pivoted around to track it like a bird of prey. I had to drop out of sight more than once, because of how sensitive she was to changes in the light, although I think I managed to avoid her line of sight, because when I finally snuck into the house via the back door, she was in the exact same spot, staring into the darkness like a blind man. For a moment I thought I was safe in the shadows, but whatever this thing was, it didn't seem so committed to playing human. As soon as I got near the stairs, her eyes fixed on me like a hound's, and she came barreling forward on every limb she had. What little of her was visible in the moonlight looked almost fish-like, like she'd been pulled out of the bottom of a lake. She still had the general shape of a person, I guess, only it was like something wearing a human suit when that was falling apart. Her joints slipped up and down her bones like they were on a pulley, and they bent backwards and forwards and sideways. As she got closer, I smelled her, and it was like rotten milk and dog shit left in a hot car. It hit me hard enough to water my eyes and make climbing the stairs difficult. Of course, I didn't get very far. I didn't know what the hell was going on, nor did I have strength to fight it. The last thing I remember was the sight of her ribs pressing against her skin like fingers trying to poke through a rubber sheet, like they were alive inside of her and wanted out. "Baby need a feed?" she asked before grabbing my head and slamming it backwards into the step behind me. I awoke with a foul taste in my mouth. I'd been strapped into the high chair, and I looked around groggily until I laid eyes on a baby bottle. The congealed contents were the color of a smoker's fingers, with visible lumps of pink matter lurking towards the bottom like syrup in a milkshake. "Straight from the source," my wife said, her misshapen fingers stroking my hairless head. I realized that my legs were in agony, and I saw that there must have been a dozen needles poking out of my skin and right through the pajamas she dressed me in. She pressed a finger against one, and for a second the pain became so white-hot that I nearly passed out all over again. I fought hard to stay awake, desperate to avoid another feeding. Although a part of me wondered if I wanted to endure the second one while awake. But when it all came down to it, it was just her in my way, wasn't it? And that hatred inside me burned up like a pyre, and I realized that I wouldn't mind dying all that much. I'd secretly hoped for so long that I could maybe fix this somehow, maybe even get back to normal, and get my body back. I didn't know how, but I'd let myself think that it could be possible. Sitting there, looking at her loom over me, I decided that living like this wasn't really an option anymore. My hands were free. Who could blame her for leaving them like that? I couldn't hit her or kick her. I didn't have the reach or the strength. But I did have something sharp, so I reached down and tore a needle free, and before she could try and get it out of my hand I shoved it through her palm. It went right through like she'd been made of nothing more substantial than some thick wool. It didn't even make a noise, although the stench she emitted became unbearably strong. She looked angry. Good, I thought, and I reached down and grabbed another, and this time she tried to be quicker, but it just meant her face got closer. So close that the moonlight hit it, and for a moment I hesitated because I finally saw just how fucking god-awful she really was. You could see where all that skin was just slipping away and hanging loose like a badly made mask, and whatever was underneath, it looked a little like a spider. Not a spider's face, mind you. No, like she had a spider for a face, only it was a spider with too many legs that were all curled up like it had been stamped on a few times. Like her whole skull was a ball made out of furry rubber bands. But she still had eyes, and they looked mostly human. And like I said, she'd gotten in so close I could see those hairs twitch and wriggle, and that meant I could lunge forward and jam that needle right into her eye. Pushing so hard that by the end it was as embedded in the palm of my hand as it was in her skull, or whatever she had. I don't know what exactly was in there, but it must have hurt because she let out a scream that drew blood from my ears, and she ran off into the dark, desperate to get far, far away from whatever had caused her pain. I didn't have much time. I slipped loose from the chair and ran from the house, stopping only long enough to catch a glimpse of a shadow passing over the house, as if something had flown over. It's hard for me to say what exactly, but I had a vague notion that some of the lampposts in the nearby street were moving, and that they reached way too high into the sky. I felt her leave. Jesus fucking Christ, I felt her leave, and it was like the popping of a cyst. It hurt bad. It hurt like nothing I'd ever felt. It wasn't a protracted injury, just more like being shot, I imagine. I don't know. I reached the gate and saw somehow that my hand dwarfed the lock, and by the time I'd fumbled it open, I was already hurtling towards the ground like a falling tree. I reached the gate and saw somehow that my hand dwarfed the lock, and by the time I'd fumbled it open, I was already hurtling towards the ground like a falling tree. But at least I was the right size again. I wound up having to take a trip to the hospital that same day, so they could get the remaining needles out of my leg. I was laughing so damn hard that they wound up keeping me for my own safety, which... well, I guess I can't blame them for. Between the needles and the children's clothes and the way I screamed with joy at the sight of my own hands and my hairy arms, I guess I must have really looked like a real loon. I didn't feel too bad being stuck in that place though, and they didn't keep me for long. They said something about spores in the lungs. I don't know. I don't even fucking care. I did tell them what happened, of course, but they just told me it was all the product of my mind. They say my head is fucked. I mean, they say it a little more politely than that, but that's the gist. It's fucked. They showed me a scan of my brain, and it looked like an apple after it had spent 3 weeks on the ground in mid-August. I guess I'm not an accountant anymore. Most days I'm lucky if I can work a remote. I don't really care though. For a long time she kept leaving me a packed lunch on the doorstep of my new apartment. Fucking nuts, but I almost ate 1 or 2 of them. It was that strong of a habit, you know. But instead I always made a big show of throwing the food right in the bin. The last box was full of divorce paperwork, although it didn't look official. More like a bad joke, but that was the whole marriage, wasn't it? Just a bad joke. I signed them in crayon and left them outside.